The first thing you need to understand is that my well has always been a source of pride. Yes, a well. Old, deep, with a heavy wooden lid and that old movie vibe. The water there is clean, fresh, pure. It tastes like childhood and silence. For years, I used it to water my plants, fill the dogs' buckets, wet the grass. That simplicity of someone who still believes that some things in life can come straight from the earth, without going through 38 treatment plants and a water bill with mysterious fees that nobody explains. But of course, like everything in life that works well, someone always comes along and tries to spoil it. And in my case, she did. That neighbor who arrived thinking the street was an extension of her house. It didn't take her long to make it clear that she didn't like trees that provided shade, children who laughed loudly, or dogs that barked without an appointment. The woman was basically a sentinel of annoyance. At first, she pretended to be friendly. That little smile that looks more like a facial spasm. She'd ask about the plants, the yard, take a covert peek in the direction of my well, as if she didn't give a damn. But I saw it. I always did. She looked with that silent desire of someone who's already plotting. But I'm one of those people who doesn't interfere in other people's lives, as long as they don't interfere in mine. But then things started to get weird. First, there was the bucket. One day it was there, next to the well. The next, it was gone. Then it was the water level, which had always maintained a standard, suddenly starting to drop in a strange way, as if someone had replaced my well with a toilet in a bus station. And it hadn't rained for weeks, so it didn't make sense for it to drop so low. I started to get suspicious, of course. But you'll prove it, right? After all, what kind of human being thinks it's acceptable to invade other people's backyards to steal water? Water! The woman had a modern house, plumbing, a 3-stage filter, but she decided that the best source of hydration was my well, the only rustic item that still worked in my life. And things went from there. One day, I came home early from work and saw the scene with my own eyes. There she was, on her knees at the edge of the well, lowering a bucket with a makeshift rope. Rope, people, scene from an Old West movie, in my backyard. And the most cynical thing? When she saw me, she pretended she was just curious about the structure. Curious. The woman had a bucket full in her hand. I didn't make a fuss. I just looked. That look that pierces the soul. She was disconcerted, but didn't apologize. She just walked away, as if nothing had happened. The audacity of people like that fascinates me. Over the next few days, I monitored her. I didn't tell anyone. I just watched. I put some pebbles near the well. Every time they disappeared, I knew she had gone there again. One day I found wet footprints in the grass. Footprints, ladies and gentlemen, like in a bad episode of Rural CSI. And the more I saw, the more I was filled with hatred. But a creative hatred, you know? I didn't want to fight. I wanted poetry. Revenge with a signature. That's when the idea came to me. A skunk. Yes, a skunk. The universe gave me this gift when one appeared in my yard a few days later. Did it stink the soul? Yes, but I looked at that animal and saw an ally, a chemical weapon of nature. I carefully collected some of the skunk's essence. Don't ask me how. Just accept it. And I mixed it with a bucket of water, making a kind of infusion of the apocalypse. I got up early, went to the well, opened the lid, and threw everything in. The lid stayed in place, as always. But the smell, my God, the smell was an invisible punch. And then I waited. I just waited. Because I knew it. That woman wasn't going to resist. Fresh water, free of charge, in the dead of day. She was going to come back. She always did. It didn't take 2 days. In the early hours of a sultry Tuesday, when even the wind seemed too lazy to blow, I woke up to a muffled noise coming from the yard. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but for someone who sleeps lightly and whose nerves have been on alert since sharing a street with a water thief, any different sound activates an internal radar that even a psychologist can't explain. I got out of bed in the dark, without turning on the light, and peeked through the gap in the living room curtain. There she was, again, crouched down, with a small flashlight stuck to her forehead. Yes, She wore those little climber's torches, thinking she was on a military mission. The scene was pathetic and poetic at the same time. The woman, in that clandestine nymph pose, lowering the bucket down the contaminated well with an almost spiritual concentration. She didn't know, and that's what made it all the better. The bucket went down, came back full, and she held on tight, with the same excitement as a child catching a fish in his grandfather's pond. Then she looked around and left slowly, as if it were possible to erase the crime with silent steps. The next morning, I woke up early, as usual. I had my coffee with a sense of accomplishment. The sky was gray, but I was at peace. I had no way of predicting the exact time of the damage, but I knew one thing. The smell wouldn't be long in coming. That mixture of water, old wood, and skunk essence had the power to turn any environment into a sensory nightmare. And I didn't have to wait long. At 9:10 in the morning, a time that had already become my new religion, I heard a scream. Yes, a scream. Long, drawn out, with that tone of panic and disgust that you can't fake. I ran to the window like someone who hears fireworks out of season, and there she was, in the backyard of her house, hose in hand, shaking as if she'd been bitten by a snake. Her garden, that ridiculous garden decorated with white stones and statues of angels, was soaking wet, and, at that moment, scented with the touch of hell. She began to cough, backing away. She shook her head, sniffed her clothes, sniffed her arm, looked at the hose, as if it were the devil materialized. The desperation was legitimate. The woman looked like an actress from a Mexican soap opera, but with no rehearsal. And there I was, behind the curtain, with a smile on my face that not even extra strong coffee could explain. Justice was being done in real time. By midday, she had washed everything 3 times. She wore gloves and a cloth mask, and walked around the yard with a spray bottle of vinegar in her hand, as if that was going to save anything. The smell, poor thing, was persistent. Anyone who has ever smelled skunk pee knows. It doesn't dissolve. It seeps in. It's the kind of scent that marks territory, that sticks to the soul. The well water was now a chemical signature, and she had used it to water everything. Orchids, basil, even the ferns she loved to boast about as being grown with mineral water. It was 3 days before she came knocking on my door. She didn't look like the same woman. She was haggard, her hair was tied back lazily, her eyes were deep, surrounded by dark circles that screamed, "I haven't slept since Tuesday." She knocked on the door with a trembling hand. When I opened it, she was holding a plastic cup, half full of a dark liquid. She didn't say anything. She just held out the glass. I stared at it. She said, in a voice that sounded more like a whisper, begging forgiveness, "Did this water come from your well?" I pretended to think. I tilted my head, looked doubtful, and even scratched my chin. Then I answered, like someone who drops a bomb and walks away. "I don't know, neighbor. I'm the only one who uses that well. But maybe the earth has been stressed. It may have been crying inside." She widened her eyes, turned around and left, without saying another word. Her glass still in her hand, walking faster than her legs, as if she was afraid the smell would rise again just because she'd asked. Since that day, he's never touched my fence. The well was left in peace. The pebbles I used to keep an eye on it stopped disappearing. What's more, she started crossing the street when she saw me sweeping the sidewalk. She became someone else, no longer invasive, just scared, as if she'd been exorcised, or marked by some mysterious force of nature that she dared to violate. 2 Sundays after the aromatic incident, the woman reappeared with a new strategy, diplomacy disguised as aggressive civility. She arrived at my door with a jar of sugar-free cookies and a smile on her face that looked more like a muscle spasm. Those unexpected visits that come with the smell of a con. Literally, in her case, because the smell of skunk pee still seemed to float around like an invisible aura of traumatic memory. She said she wanted to start again, that the neighborhood deserved harmony, and that the misunderstandings of the past should be buried. She spoke with such artificial politeness that it made you want to shout. And while she was spilling out her speech, she began to drop a few suggestions, like someone throwing crumbs of manipulation. Perhaps we could share the use of the well. You see, she no longer wanted to steal. Now she wanted to institutionalize theft with a signature and a pat on the back. She said she had bought a special filter, that she wanted to make community gardens, only on her land, of course, and that this would benefit the whole neighborhood. I just listened, quietly, with an expression that she probably mistook for consideration, but which was really just restraint. Because if I opened my mouth there, acid rain would come out. The creature's audacity was so absurd that for a moment I thought I was being pranked. But I wasn't. It was real. It really believed that after invading my yard, sucking up my water and turning my well into an episode of nasal terror, it would still have the nerve to ask for a partnership. I refused with all the kindness my patience allowed at the time. I told her that the well was private, that my water wasn't available to anyone with a history of stealing it, and that I wasn't trustworthy enough to share the shade of my tree, let alone an underground resource. She was visibly annoyed. Her mouth trembled slightly, but her smile was still there, frozen, like an election campaign banner that nobody wants to see anymore. She said she respected my decision, but left stumbling over her own intentions. I thought the subject had died there. My illusion. The following week, I started to notice strange things in the yard. Footprints, marks in the dirt, the bucket reappearing out of place. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. But no, the woman was back. Only now she was doing everything more carefully, as if to prove that she could continue using the water without being caught, a kind of silent revenge. But if she wanted to play at silence, I was going to respond with a show. I waited for her to act once more. Early on Thursday morning, there she was. Again, the ridiculous flashlight stuck to her forehead, the improvised rope, the precision of someone who thought she was living a secret operation. When she left with a full bucket, I sprang into action. This time, I was more creative. I mixed fermented garlic essence, dried onion extract, and a bit of curdled milk that I had saved to water the plants. A combination that not even a chemical laboratory would dare to manipulate. I poured everything into the well with the same care as an alchemist preparing a revenge potion. It was the perfect cocktail. Natural, organic, and absolutely devastating. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of a hose being turned on. I went to the window and saw the exact moment when she sprayed that cursed mixture on the garden. Her tomatoes had wilted, literally. The mint stalks shriveled up as if they had seen death itself. And she widened her eyes, looked at the bucket, and sniffed her own blouse. Her expression was a mixture of disappointment, anger, and sheer nausea. She ran into the house as if she had been attacked by invisible bees. She spent the rest of the day trying to disguise the botanical tragedy with artificial flowers and throwing incense everywhere. But nothing hid the fact. Her gourmet garden had turned into a radioactive zone. She tried to look at me through the window in the late afternoon, but she couldn't even hold her gaze. She was humiliated, defeated, and yet I felt it wasn't over. People like that can't accept losing. They retreat, they plan, and they come back more sour. On Saturday morning, the sky was overcast, and the street was quieter than usual. It was like that fake calm in a bad movie before disaster strikes. I already knew something strange was coming. I could feel it in the air, in the way the birds were restless, and in the fact that, since the last aromatic incident, she hadn't even looked in my direction. When someone like that keeps quiet, it's because they're boiling inside. And it was around 10 in the morning that the show began. Out of nowhere, I heard a scream coming from the street. It wasn't a cry for help or a fight. It was a performative cry, full of drama, like the ones you hear in a Mexican soap opera when the character discovers that her own son is actually her lost brother. I went to the gate, of course. Curiosity is a blessing when someone else's misfortune is on show. And there she was, the woman, sitting on the sidewalk in front of her house, dressed in white, barefoot, with a tiara of dried flowers on her head and a bucket by her side. The bucket, of course, was the same one she used at my well. She was holding a small bottle of water, looking up at the sky and muttering things as if she were invoking the gods of purity. At first, I thought it was some kind of alternative protest, I don't know, but then she started crying. She cried loudly, with exaggerated sobs, pausing to see if the neighbors were watching. And they were. One by one, they began to appear at the windows, at the doors, holding cups of coffee or cell phones, not knowing whether to call the psychiatrist or the cell phone camera. Then she suddenly stood up, waving her water bottle in the air as if it were a trophy, and began to give a speech. She said she was being persecuted, boycotted, the victim of liquid psychological warfare. She used those words, liquid psychological warfare, that she had dreams with the smell of death, that her plants were being attacked by an invisible entity, and that she just wanted to water her vegetable garden in peace, with dignity and access to the collective underground. That's when I understood. She had gone crazy, but not a genuine outburst, the kind that calls for real help. It was pure staging, a desperate attempt to turn the tables by shouting. She wanted to embarrass, to turn the villain into a victim, to attract pity, to turn the well thief into a martyr for wronged irrigation. And then, to seal the ridicule, she turned the bucket on her head. Yes, the bucket, full of water, and she got all wet, in a ridiculous attempt to symbolize her spiritual purification. Her white dress became a clinging garment, showing more than it should, and she stood there, soaking wet, shivering, looking like she'd just escaped an emotional shipwreck. The silence in the street was sepulchral. Not a dog barked. A small child, who was watching from the balcony with his grandmother, asked loudly, "Grandma, why is she bathing herself?" And his grandmother's reply was, "Because some people are not only crazy, they're a show-off." She then turned to me. She stared at me, and she shouted, her voice strained and theatrical, "You won. I hope you sleep well knowing that you killed my lavender and my spirit." And before I could say anything, he ran into the house, slamming the gate so hard that he knocked over the vase in the driveway. The noise was the perfect end to the theater. After that, the neighborhood was never the same again. The woman retreated like a wet cat. She didn't show up for the association's monthly meeting. She stopped giving her opinion on other people's garbage, no longer obsessively cleaned the sidewalk or looked down on passers-by. He became a shadow. The neighbors, who used to just whisper, now openly laughed at her. The nickname, Saint of the Well, caught on with impressive speed. And the well? It remained intact, untouched, respected as it should have been from the start. Today, when I pass by it, because, yes, it still lives here, quiet, almost camouflaged in its own shame, I give a short, polite nod, just to keep the sarcasm alive. And every time I open the lid of the well, I feel a twinge of pride, not just for having protected something of mine, but for having done so with strategic elegance and a generous pinch of symbolic poison. Because some people learn through dialogue, there are people who learn from mistakes, and there are people who only learn when the skunk enters the story. Do you agree with me? Let me know in the comments what you think about all this.